They fired me after 9 years, said I was too comfortable, even though I brought in 40% of their revenue. I didn't argue. I just opened my personal phone and started dialing. Brent Ellison didn't even bother to look up from the paperwork when he said it. We need hungrier talent, Miles. People willing to meet aggressive new targets. His hand slid the termination letter across the polished conference table like it was just another quarterly report. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask questions. I just looked at the ink on the paper and then back at the man who'd been in the building for 6 months but still didn't know where the client trust was really stored. 9 years. That's how long I'd been at Trevant Corp, building accounts that brought in nearly 40% of the company's annual revenue. Not through hype or shortcuts, just time, grit, and a reputation earned one meeting at a time. I nodded, stood up, and thanked him for the opportunity like I'd just finished a polite interview. He looked surprised. Maybe he expected an argument, a plea, a burst of ego. What he got instead was silence. I walked past the floor-to-ceiling windows that once showcased my office view, the one they'd moved me out of a month ago. Something about restructuring, I remember thinking at the time, they always move the furniture first. It's quieter that way. I walked back to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the cardboard box I kept for emergencies. Funny how we prepare for storms we pretend we don't see coming. Jenna, my former assistant, glanced over from her cubicle, concern in her eyes but no words. I gave her the smallest of nods. She'd know soon enough. I didn't pack much, just what mattered. Family photo with Rebecca and the kids, the mug my daughter painted in 3rd grade, a paperweight shaped like a compass gifted by my first client who said I always pointed him in the right direction, and a slim folder of handwritten notes and personal contacts. Not company property, just people. People I'd built something real with. No CRM system could replicate that. As I made my way toward the elevator, I passed 2 interns laughing over something on their phones. They didn't even register me. 9 years, and I was already invisible. When the elevator doors opened, I found myself standing next to Owen Wallace, the CEO. He nodded vaguely, eyes glued to his phone. He had no idea what Brent had just done. No idea that the next 90 days of revenue forecasts were about to fall off a cliff. And I didn't say a word. Not out of pride, just clarity. The kind that only comes when someone does you the favor of revealing exactly how little they ever understood your value. I walked through the lobby like a man finishing a book he already knew the ending to. The receptionist smiled politely. "Have a great day, Mr. Carrington." I smiled back. "You too, Michelle." I meant it. It wasn't her fault the building was on fire and no one had seen the smoke yet. Outside, the sky was low and gray, the kind of afternoon where nothing feels urgent and everything feels inevitable. I tossed the box in the passenger seat, got in, and drove. No radio, no calls, just the rhythm of the tires and the quiet click of realization. Not sadness, not fury, just stillness. Like a pause before a storm shifts direction. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the front door I'd walked through 1,000 times, but never with this much clarity. They didn't just end my time at Trevant. They ended the illusion that it had ever really belonged to me. But what they didn't know, what Brent and Owen and all their metrics would never understand, is that the clients never belonged to Trevant either. Not really. They trusted me. And trust doesn't sit in a database. It doesn't get reassigned. It walks out with the person who earned it. I picked up the cardboard box, locked the car, and stepped into my house. That was the last moment Trevant Corp still held something I didn't. By the time the front door clicked shut, everything had already begun to shift. Quietly, permanent. The box sat untouched on the kitchen counter, like a time capsule from a life that no longer existed. I stood in the doorway for a minute, just watching it, as if it might open itself and spill out the years I'd poured into that company. 9 years of missed dinners, early flights, weekend calls, and client fires no one else could put out. I didn't unpack. Instead, I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, something quiet and honest, and walked to the living room, letting the house settle around me. Rebecca was still in Denver with her sister, helping out with the new baby. It was probably for the best. I needed the silence to think, and I needed the space to remember. I sat down with my laptop and opened a folder labeled Personal. Inside were spreadsheets, notes, calendar reminders, nothing confidential, nothing stolen, just history, just names. Over 200 of them, CEOs, COOs, purchasing directors, people I'd met for lunch, called at 10 p.m. on a Saturday, talked through the death of a spouse or the birth of a child. Contracts didn't build those relationships. Consistency did. I scrolled through the list, each name a story. Travis Hensley, 6 years of quarterly reviews and one wild trip to Boise during a snowstorm. James Henderson, the man who trusted me enough to extend a 5-year contract when everyone else was pulling back during the recession. Peter Carlton, the skeptic who once told me, "I don't trust anyone under 50, I had just turned 46. These weren't accounts, they were relationships. Ones Brent didn't understand and Owen had forgotten. On the other end of my kitchen counter, my work phone sat powered off in a box. Company issued, locked down, wiped remotely the minute I left the building. It held nothing that mattered. The real conversations, the dinner invites, the personal numbers, they were all here, in my hands on my personal device. Because relationships don't live in policies, they live in people. I took a slow sip of bourbon and opened a different folder, this one titled Comp. I scanned through the PDF of my employment contract until I found the clause I already knew was there. Non-compete, limited to 1 year, and only enforceable in cases of voluntary resignation. Brent might wear tailored suits and talk like a TED Talk on repeat, but he clearly didn't read the fine print. Or maybe he thought I wouldn't. Either way, he'd fired me. Which meant the clause no longer applied. I was free. Not in the rebellious, dramatic sense, just legally, professionally, surgically free. I could reach out to every name on that list without breaking a single rule. But I wouldn't do it tonight. Not out of restraint, out of discipline. You don't call people in the middle of the night unless it's a crisis, and this wasn't. It was an opening, a shift, a correction. They thought I'd panic, scramble, maybe beg. But I wasn't built that way. You don't spend 9 years becoming indispensable only to fall apart in a day. That's not how real value works. I looked out the window, the streetlights blinking on across the neighborhood. A quiet Tuesday in a cul-de-sac that had no idea what storm just got redirected. Tomorrow morning, I would make exactly 3 calls, no pitches, no bitterness, just clarity. I'm no longer with Trevant as of yesterday. Wanted you to hear it from me first. That's all I'd say, and that's all I'd need to say. The rest would move on its own, like gravity. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the weight of the moment settle in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel bound to a forecast, a pipeline, or a quarterly metric. I wasn't someone's retention risk or legacy asset. I was just Miles Carrington. And tomorrow, that name would be worth a hell of a lot more than the logo they stamped on the glass of a downtown high-rise. The house was still dark when I woke. No alarm, no meeting to prepare for. Just the kind of morning where your mind wakes you up before the sun does. Not out of anxiety, but purpose. I showered, shaved, dressed like I always had, even though I had nowhere to be. Same watch, same cufflinks. There's something about keeping rituals that tells the world you're not off balance, even when everything's shifted. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and laid my phone face down. For 20 minutes, I didn't move. I just stared at the wood grain of the table, the faint ring left by years of hurried breakfasts and late-night reports. Then, I picked up the phone and made the first call. "Travis," I said when he answered, "wanted you to hear it from me. I'm no longer with Trevant as of yesterday." There was a beat of silence, then, "What happened?" I kept it simple. Leadership made a decision. Brent Ellison's handling things now. Another pause, longer this time. That kid from the meeting? I could hear the disbelief sharpen in his voice. He doesn't know our business. "I know," I said, and that was all. "So what now?" he asked. "That's up to you," I replied. "Just thought you deserved to know." He didn't thank me. He didn't say goodbye, he just hung up. Not in anger, but in calculation. I knew that sound well. It was the quiet click of a decision being made. I didn't linger. I tapped the next number. James Henderson picked up on the second ring. "Miles, didn't expect to hear from you this early. Didn't expect to be making this call," I said. "Just letting you know, effective yesterday, I'm no longer with Trevant." "What?" he said, then again, softer. "What?" I explained it the same way. Direct, clean. No emotion. "Who's running your desk now? Brent, maybe Amber Knox, I don't know." "They're not you." "They don't need to be," I said, knowing exactly how wrong that would feel in his ears. "The account's still theirs." "Not for long," he said, and then he thanked me, for the honesty, for the years, for the heads up, that was all. The third call went to Peter Carlton. He didn't pick up. I left a message, just the same few lines. No drama, no pitch, just facts. And then I turned the phone off. Not to ignore what was coming, but to give it room to move on its own. That's how trust works in this business. You don't have to chase it. You just have to not lose it. I stood at the sink, watching the sky bleed from navy to gold, and I knew something had shifted. Not in the headlines, not in the stock price, but in the current, in the thing underneath it all. Because for the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't speaking as a representative. I was speaking as myself. And it turned out that was more than enough. By 10 a.m., I turned my phone back on. 7 missed calls, 2 from Travis, 1 from Peter, followed by a text, "Call me ASAP." I didn't return any of them, not yet. I had no script, no office, no infrastructure, just a reputation, and apparently that was louder than any press release Trevant could issue. By noon, my inbox had lit up. Personal messages, LinkedIn notes, vendors, analysts. Word had gotten out. The industry talks, quietly, quickly, and only when something actually matters. And this mattered. At 2:12 p.m., I got the first signal that Traven had noticed. A voicemail from Owen Wallace. Measured voice, layers of calm covering something close to panic. "Miles, we need to talk about your transition. Several key accounts have reached out. It's causing some confusion." I replayed the message once, then again. Some confusion was corporate speak for everything's on fire and we don't know where the hose is. I didn't call back. There was nothing to clarify. I hadn't poached anyone. I hadn't made a single ask. I had just told the truth. And truth, when it's been silenced for too long, tends to echo louder than lies. At 3:45 p.m., Brent texted, "Let's align on your exit package. There might be room for consulting work." I stared at the screen for a moment and put the phone down. Not because I was above it, but because I was past it. When someone shows you your value too late, the offer doesn't feel generous. It feels pathetic. I made 3 calls that morning, not to start a war, just to end an illusion. They didn't fire an employee. They severed the lifeline to $3,200,000, 0 cents in active contracts. And now all I had to do was stay quiet and let gravity do the rest. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, the ripple had become a wave. What started as 3 quiet calls that morning had turned into 8 terminated contracts by evening, each one severed cleanly, citing change in relationship management as the reason. No emotion, no drama. Just the language of people who understood exactly what each one trusted. I didn't have to orchestrate it. I didn't make a single pitch. All I did was remove myself from the equation and the equation collapsed. That's the thing about being the invisible thread tying everything together. No one notices you until they try to tug the ends without you. Owen Wallace called again at 6:27 p.m. This time, his voice cracked in the middle of the message. "We need to speak immediately. There's some concern from the board. We weren't aware of how deeply these accounts were tied to your personal management." I sat at the kitchen table, swirling the last of my bourbon in the glass, letting the ice melt a little slower than usual. That word, concern, had done a lot of lifting in my career. It usually meant someone up top had just realized they were driving without a map. Brent didn't call. He texted again, though. "Full salary for 6 months, stock options, help us transition accounts." I didn't reply. Not because I was vengeful, but because Brent Ellison wasn't offering help, he was offering hush. It was a corporate reflex. Throw money at the thing you can't control. But this wasn't about control, not anymore. This was about truth. And truth was moving faster than he could catch. At 7:41 p.m., Travis texted, "Just got off a call with Owen and Brent. They offered a 10% discount to stay." I wrote back one word, "And?" His reply came 30 seconds later. I terminated the contract, told them it's a relationship issue, not a pricing one. I stared at that message for a long time. Not out of surprise, but recognition. That's what I'd built. Not sales, not contracts, trust. The kind that doesn't bend when someone waves a discount like a white flag. I poured another drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my email. 3 new messages from former clients, all of them curious, all of them available. I didn't answer any of them, not yet. I wasn't collecting victories. I was watching a story unfold the way I always suspected it might if I ever stopped being the one holding it together. That night, Jenna called from a personal number. Her voice was lower than usual. "It's chaos in here," she said. 8 accounts gone. Brent's blaming you. Owen's demanding explanations. The board is furious. No one saw this coming. I smiled for the first time all day, not because I wanted chaos, but because they thought they'd built an empire, not realizing the foundation was me. They're accusing you of tampering, she added, of making calls. I made 3, I said calmly. No offers, no pitches. I know, she replied. That's what makes it worse for them, she paused. They're starting to understand that people followed you because of you. That's when I knew. The domino wasn't just tipping, it was accelerating. This wasn't about me leaving, it was about them realizing, too late, that they never owned what I built. They just borrowed it, and now the lender had walked away. The next morning, I didn't check the news, didn't scan earnings reports, didn't look for fallout. I already knew where the pieces were landing. What I didn't expect was the number that lit up my phone at 10:07. I almost let it go to voicemail, but instinct told me otherwise. Miles Carrington, I answered, calm, measured. The voice on the other end was warm, confident, familiar in a way that made me sit a little straighter. Michael Grantley here, Grantley & Co. I've been hearing your name quite a bit this week. Seems like we have a few friends in common. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill with implication. He continued, I'll get to the point. We're expanding our executive leadership and building a more relationship-centric model. Your reputation fits what we're building. I didn't interrupt. I knew what was coming. We'd like to bring you on as senior vice president. You'd have full autonomy, manage your own portfolio, sit on the executive committee, and... He paused, a signing bonus of 6 figures, equity included. No dance, no empty praise, just recognition, something I hadn't felt in months. When would you want me to start? I asked. He didn't hesitate. How's tomorrow sound? I smiled. Not out of pride, but relief. Not because I was desperate to move, but because someone finally understood that my value didn't start or stop at a logo. Tomorrow's perfect, I said, and that was that. No back and forth, no negotiating dignity, just alignment. I hung up and looked around the room. Same furniture, same framed photos, but something had changed, not just the job, the temperature. When someone finally sees your worth without needing you to prove it again, the air feels lighter. I opened my laptop and began outlining the accounts I could bring over without ever making a pitch. Not stolen, not coerced, just realigned. I didn't send a single email that day. Didn't post on LinkedIn. But by 3 p.m. I'd received 7 new inquiries from former clients. Questions like, where are you now? And are you still in the game? I responded to each the same way. I'll have an update soon. That was all. Because people don't follow updates, they follow consistency. And in a world full of shifting priorities and revolving door account managers, consistency is a rare currency. Brent thought he replaced a role. Owen thought they let go of a title. But what they actually did was free me from a place that no longer valued the thing I gave most, credibility. And now, I wasn't starting over. I was starting ahead. It was late afternoon when my phone lit up with a text that didn't belong to the storm of clients, colleagues, or congratulatory noise swirling around me. It was Jenna, my former assistant, the one who noticed the small things, like when my name disappeared from a meeting invite or when my office was reassigned without warning. Her message was simple. Call me when you're alone. I stepped out onto the porch, the late autumn air cool against my skin, and dialed. She picked up immediately. I'm breaking some rules by telling you this, she said, her voice low but steady, but you need to know the full picture. I didn't say anything, just listened. This wasn't just Brent wanting to bring in his own people. It wasn't about performance or direction or culture fit. She paused, and I could almost hear her glance over her shoulder. They were planning to sell the firm. I stood still, not surprised, just suddenly understanding the shape of a shadow I'd been walking in for months. Veritas Capital made an offer 2 months ago. They were clear. They wanted to absorb our client base into their existing structure. But there was a condition. They didn't want those relationships tied too tightly to any one person, especially you. My jaw clenched, but I didn't interrupt. They've been trying to gradually unhook your accounts, she continued. Amber wasn't a replacement. She was a placeholder, someone they could package in a clean transition. Brent wasn't hired to grow revenue. He was brought in to separate you from your clients without making it obvious. Everything clicked into place, not just the dismissal, but the demotions that came before it. The expense report questions, the travel request denials, the new commission plan that quietly undercut me. Not sabotage, strategy. I exhaled slowly. How do you know this? I'm still assigned to the executive suite, she said. I see the documents. I hear the calls. Yesterday, Veritas pulled out of the deal. said the risk was too high after the client exodus. I leaned against the railing, phone pressed to my ear, staring out into the quiet street as her words sank in. They were planning the sale while I was still working weekends for renewal calls, I said, not as a question, just the bitter truth of it. They needed you gone, she said, softer now. Because you succeeded too well. The relationships were too strong, too personal. They couldn't sell what they couldn't separate. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Not rage, not grief. Something quieter, something heavier. I'd always known loyalty wasn't currency in corporate strategy, but I never expected to become a liability for doing my job too well. You were never just part of the firm, Miles, she said. You were the firm. And they couldn't admit that, so they erased it instead. I didn't speak for a while, neither did she. When we finally hung up, I stood there with the phone still in my hand, the sun almost gone now, casting long shadows across the porch floorboards. They hadn't fired me. They'd extracted me, surgically, intentionally, like removing a middleman who had grown too central to the transaction. And the worst part? I hadn't seen it coming. Because I was still believing in something they'd already sold behind closed doors. But now I knew. And knowing changed everything. 3 weeks after the fallout, I stood backstage at the Midwest Financial Services Conference with a name tag that didn't say Trevant. It said Grantley & Co., and underneath, in smaller font, Miles Carrington, partner. I hadn't asked for the invitation. It found me. Someone on the organizing committee thought it would be poetic to put me on the client loyalty in a transactional market panel. I almost declined, but then I saw who else was attending. Owen Wallace never missed this event. Neither did several of Trevant's board members. The irony was too precise to ignore. I didn't prepare flashy slides or clever anecdotes. I brought data, not vengeance, just metrics. I spent nights with Grantley's analysts compiling the performance metrics of every client that had followed me from Trevant. Response times, implementation costs, satisfaction scores. The results spoke louder than any speech ever could. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. I talked about how, in a world obsessed with automation and AI, the rarest commodity had become personal accountability. I said companies often forget that client relationships aren't assets. They're trust agreements built between individuals. And when you treat those individuals as interchangeable, clients will show you exactly how wrong that assumption is. I watched from the stage as heads nodded across the ballroom, and when I glanced to the back corner, I saw him, Owen, standing with 2 board members near the coffee station, frozen. His eyes met mine for half a second. I didn't blink. I just turned back to the moderator and kept talking. I showed our findings. Response times down 53%, implementation cost down 30%, satisfaction up by 22 points. I didn't gloat, I didn't posture. I presented truth like a mirror. Clean, quiet, undeniable. During the Q&A, a young analyst asked what everyone else was thinking. Isn't your move from Trevant to Grantley, with several clients following, exactly the risk companies fear when giving too much autonomy to relationship managers? The room held its breath. He smiled. I didn't smile. That's a fair question, I said, but consider the alternative. Trevant didn't lose those clients because I left. They lost them because they failed to understand what those clients truly valued. It wasn't loyalty to me, it was loyalty to how I worked, how I listened, how I showed up. I let the silence settle before delivering the last line. Every company has the right to change direction, and every client has the right to decide whether that new direction still serves their best interest. The market is brutally efficient that way. When the panel ended, 3 more former clients approached me. By the end of the day, Grantley had signed letters of intent worth another $2,700,000, and I hadn't made a single offer. I hadn't needed to. Trust moves faster than strategy, and unlike strategy, it doesn't need permission. I was back in the office the following Monday, reviewing onboarding metrics for 2 new client teams, when the envelope arrived. No sender name, no company logo, just cream-colored stationery sealed by hand and couriered directly to my assistant. She handed it to me with a raised eyebrow. Old school, she said. I nodded, but said nothing. I knew exactly who had sent it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Neat, deliberate, the kind of script you learned when you grow up thinking you'll sign shareholder letters for a living. I opened the flap and slid out a single sheet. No letterhead. Just ink and white space. You were right. I put transaction above relationship, and it cost the company everything. If you're ever willing to have coffee, I'd appreciate the chance to apologize in person. Owen. I folded the paper once and placed it in my jacket pocket without a word. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't scan it, archive it, or forward it to legal. I didn't even consider writing back. Not because I didn't forgive him, but because I didn't need the apology. Not anymore. That ship had sunk the moment he nodded through my termination in that elevator, too busy checking his phone to see the fault line being drawn beneath his feet. Still, I didn't throw the note away. I carried it with me for the rest of the week, tucked in the inside pocket of my blazer, like a scar I no longer needed to hide. That Friday, I drove past Trevant's downtown building on my way to lunch. The glass sign was being removed from the facade, cranes peeling off the logo letter by letter. The Business Journal had already reported they were downsizing, shifting operations to a cheaper suburban space after the Veritas deal fell through and stock value tanked another 8%. I didn't slow down, didn't take a photo, didn't smile. I just kept driving, forward, towards something that finally belonged to me. 1 year to the day since Brent slid that termination paper across the conference table, I signed the final documents making me a full equity partner at Grantley & Co. I closed the folder and looked out my new office window at the same Kansas City skyline I'd watched from Trevant, only now it looked different, clearer. Not because the view had changed, but because I finally understood what I was seeing. Miles Carrington, partner. Not a title someone could take with a pen stroke. Not a role I could be written out of. This time, the foundation had my name etched in it. That evening, as the lights dimmed and the office emptied, I poured a quiet drink and stared at the note one last time before placing it in the drawer beneath my desk. Some apologies aren't for closure, they're for documentation, proof that the lesson had been delivered, even if it came too late to matter. The first thing I did as partner wasn't to upgrade my office or adjust my title. It wasn't to renegotiate my bonus package or hang a plaque with my name on the wall. It was to rewrite the compensation structure for every account manager at Grantley & Co. I sat with HR, finance, and legal, and I made sure it was built the way it should have always been, aligned with ownership, with voice, with permanence, no more middlemen being treated like temp workers in expensive suits. No more pretending trust was interchangeable. Every manager who brought in business would have equity tied to the accounts they nurtured. They would never wonder if one executive decision could erase everything they built. They would never be me at Trevant. That was my legacy, not revenge. Not even restoration, redesign. I wasn't interested in climbing back to where I had been. I was interested in building something that would never require that climb again. 1 month in, our onboarding process changed. New hires no longer received commission-only incentives. They received relationship maps. We trained them to understand longevity, not just volume. I reviewed every proposal before it went out, not to nitpick, but to make sure it reflected what I'd nearly lost, mutual respect. I started bringing junior team members into high-stakes meetings, not to impress clients, but to pass the torch. The first client I ever signed at Grantley was the same man who'd once told me over lunch, "You're not like the others. You listen like someone who's not trying to sell me something." That client referred 5 more. Those 5 referred 9. I didn't have to pitch. I just had to stay consistent. By Q3, our division's growth outpaced projections by 28%. But the number that mattered more? Retention. 98% of clients who followed me from Trevant were still with us. Not one had asked to speak with anyone else. I didn't flaunt those stats. I didn't send Owen or Brent a snapshot of the quarterly report. I didn't need to. Truth travels without an agenda. I spent my days differently now, still long, still full, but slower, more deliberate. I made it to my son's band performance for the first time in 4 years. I took Rebecca out to dinner on a Wednesday just because we could. I started eating lunch outside. Not everything changed. I still answered client calls at odd hours, still obsessed over minor details in contracts, still memorized birthdays, allergies, and the names of people's dogs. But now, it wasn't to protect my position. It was to honor the trust I'd earned. Trust I finally had the power to protect, not just for myself, but for everyone who came after. This wasn't a comeback. This was the first time I'd actually arrived. And this time, I wasn't standing on borrowed ground. I was building it, brick by brick. It came in just after 6, right as I was shutting my laptop and getting ready to head home. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it immediately. Amber Knox. The woman they'd brought in to shadow me without explanation. The one Brent had once introduced as a fresh perspective, though she'd barely finished onboarding before being asked to take over accounts she didn't know how to pronounce. Her voice on the voicemail was quiet, unsure. "Hi, Mr. Carrington. Miles, I hope this isn't inappropriate. I've been let go, along with most of the sales team. I know we didn't get a chance to work together properly, but I always respected the way you handled clients. If there's any chance Grantley is hiring, I'd be grateful for the opportunity to start again." I didn't listen to the message twice. I didn't need to. I forwarded it to HR with a note. "Worth interviewing, not her fault." That was all. No commentary, no judgment, because I remembered what it was like to sit in the wrong chair, being handed a list of people you didn't know, tasked with protecting revenue that had never belonged to you in the first place. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone for being cast in a bad script. I was interested in writing better ones. That same evening, as I was leaving the office, my assistant stopped me by the elevator and handed me a second envelope. This one wasn't anonymous. It was stamped with Owen Wallace's name. Inside was a second handwritten note, longer, less formal. "You were right. It wasn't about performance. It was about fear, about the kind of loyalty you can't buy, only earn, and the threat that kind of loyalty poses when we start thinking of people as liabilities instead of partners. If you're ever willing to have coffee, I'd appreciate it. Not to fix anything, just to acknowledge what I got wrong." I folded the note slowly, ran my fingers along the crease, and slid it into the same drawer as the first. No reply. Not yet. Because some wounds don't need reopening. They need time to scar over. As I walked to the parking garage, I passed a quiet thought that made me stop for just a second. 1 year ago, Brent handed me a piece of paper that ended everything. Now, I carried papers of a different kind. Ownership contracts, policy drafts, onboarding plans with my initials in the margins. Proof that the value I brought had never been abstract. They had tried to make me disposable, but all they'd done was make it clear how permanent I really was. As I drove home, the sun dipped behind the skyline like it had so many times before. Same city, same roads. But the man behind the wheel was different now. Not louder, not bolder, just steadier. Because once you've built something they tried to erase and built it again, stronger, you don't need to prove anything. You just need to keep going. They measured everything: revenue growth, quarterly projections, acquisition rates, cost per lead, retention percentages. They had dashboards and KPIs and color-coded spreadsheets that could calculate a million things except for the one that mattered most: trust. You can't quantify what it means to have a client call you on a Sunday night, not because there's an emergency, but because they trust you more than they trust anyone on their own team. You can't chart the way someone lowers their guard during a negotiation because you remembered their child's name. And you certainly can't log the weight of showing up for people when no one is watching, when there's no commission attached, when the only ROI is integrity. Travant forgot that. Maybe not all at once, maybe not with malice, but somewhere along the way, they started seeing clients as contracts, managers as overhead, and loyalty as a soft asset that could be replaced with a younger resume and a slicker pitch. What they didn't realize was that loyalty, when earned the right way, isn't soft at all. It's steel. It holds up when the market dips. It doesn't flinch when competitors circle. It resists the pressure to find cheaper alternatives. Loyalty like that isn't forged in the boardroom. It's built on the back of 1,000 moments that look insignificant until the day they aren't. They forgot that a relationship manager isn't a plug-and-play component. It's not a position you fill. It's a person you trust. And once that trust is broken, not by error, but by erasure, it doesn't come back. That's the part they never tracked. They didn't lose clients because I left. They lost them because, when I was gone, they had no one left who understood what the clients actually needed. Not in theory, in practice, in detail, in context. They thought they'd bought relationships. They forgot they'd only ever borrowed them. That's what this was about. Not revenge, not ego, not even redemption. It was about returning value to where it had always belonged, not in logos, not in systems, not in titles, but in people. Real ones. Ones who remembered birthdays, who showed up early to prep calls, who stayed late to resolve issues no one else wanted to touch. That's what they overlooked. That's what they let walk out the door without understanding what they were letting go of. And by the time they did, it was already too late, because the thing they couldn't measure was the thing they couldn't replace. For years, I carried a quiet weight, the kind you don't name because doing so might make it feel heavier. I carried it through airports and late-night emails, through client dinners where I smiled even when I was bone-tired, through weekends I promised I'd spend at home but didn't. It was the weight of being reliable in a system that saw reliability as disposable, of giving everything to a place that calculated contribution in quarterly snapshots, never in accumulated sacrifice. But the day they let me go was the day they unknowingly lifted that weight. Not instantly, not cleanly, but piece by piece as I realized that what I'd built couldn't be undone by a termination letter or a name removed from a company directory. They cut me off from a title, yes, but not from my worth. That part had never belonged to them. It had been mine all along. I didn't rebuild out of spite. I rebuilt because I'd spent too long pouring myself into something that saw me as a variable, not a cornerstone. And when I finally had the chance to start again, I made sure that no one who worked beside me would have to carry the same weight in silence. Not the account managers, not the junior analysts, not the next person who stays late, not for recognition, but because they care. At Grantley, I didn't just take a new role, I created a new structure, one that ties ownership to effort, one that honors the client relationship as a human one, not a transactional handoff. I didn't do it to prove a point. I did it so that when someone like me builds something valuable, they'll never have to watch it get reassigned like it never mattered. I still work hard, still answer the tough calls, still stay late when it's needed. But I don't carry that old fear anymore, the fear that all of it could disappear just because someone with a title decided I was replaceable. That fear's gone, and in its place is something stronger. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, the kind that comes from knowing you've built something the right way, this time, with your name on it, your values in it, and nothing to hide behind. Some people call that success. I just call it freedom. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of a time you were overlooked, replaced, or quietly erased, then maybe it wasn't just a story. Maybe it was your story too. And if it was, I hope it reminded you of this. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone else fails to recognize it. It's still there, waiting to be rebuilt, stronger and on your own terms. If you've ever walked away from a place that didn't see you and found yourself building something better after, then you already understand what real victory looks like. Quiet, steady, unshakable. If you'd like more stories like this, about people who rose after being written off, who turned silence into strategy and endings into beginnings, hit subscribe. We share these not to stir bitterness, but to restore belief in effort, in dignity, in the kind of justice only time and truth can deliver, because sometimes the best revenge is never needing to look back.